All right, here we go. Matthew chapter 2. Yeah, wow, that helped a lot. Bear with me. We got several notes here from several days and weeks of prep and preaching before. And so, Matthew chapter 2. Now, we've been looking at the prophecies of Christmas and what prophecy is and different things of this nature. Now, I know that at times this may become a little, not redundant, but to some people, a little boring. Now, I will tell you that it should not ever bore a child of God to take the Scriptures, the words of God, look at them, study them out, and to see and to understand what we really believe. This should never bother us. It shouldn't be boring at all, okay? It shouldn't be, but sometimes it is to some people. Now, in Matthew chapter number 2, okay, we have the story of the visit of the Magi, the wise men. And so what we're going to do is we're going to read, we'll just read the first 6 verses and then make some comments overall about the Gospel of Matthew and what is happening. Look at the prophecies that he's mentioning and try to walk away with a deeper understanding of why this is really so important, okay? Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Now, we've been looking at the prophecy in Matthew 1 about the virgin that's going to give birth. In Isaiah, we've briefly mentioned it. We've mentioned the prophecies here in Matthew chapter 2, briefly mentioned them, looking at how prophecy works and how God brings about prophecy, the different types of prophecy, how all of these things begin to fit together. And so point number one, Miranda, and I'm going to try to kind of direct you, Miranda, because you don't have the paper, I know. But number one, notice Matthew's purpose. Now, the reason why I want to mention this is the purpose of Matthew in writing the Gospel of Matthew. Now, what I want to do, I'm going to show you from the first 3 chapters. Okay, why is Matthew writing this? And so when I say that, I'm talking about every single word in the Gospel of Matthew. Why is it there? Why is he telling us about Mary? Why is he telling us about Joseph? Why is he telling us about the Magi? Why is he telling us about John the Baptist in chapter 3? Why is he telling us all of these things, and what is the importance of all of these things? So in number 1, in chapter number 1, the vision of Mary reveals that he, or Jesus, is the Messiah. So in chapter 1, we read about the prophet, Joseph is going to put Mary away because she's pregnant. They're engaged to be married. They've had no physical contact and relation in that fashion, and all of a sudden she's pregnant. And so Matthew is like, or Joseph is like, I'm pushing her away. I'm going to get rid of her. And then the angel appears to Matthew, and he has a vision about Mary and says, here's prophecy. The virgin will conceive, Joseph. This is it. Matthew says, this is it. Why is Matthew recording this prophecy? Why is he recording this vision? Because he wants the readers of his gospel to know that Jesus is the Messiah. He tells about the lineage of David. He talks about how he came from the line of David in chapter 1, and he's of the house of David, and Joseph is the house of David. All of these are connecting points showing that Jesus is the Messiah, because this was prophesied of Messiah. Number 2, we come to chapter number 2. We have the visit of the Magi reveals that Jesus is the King. So, time out. Everything in chapter number 1, from his lineage, ancestry, the prophecy, the vision, all of it concerns the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. And everything in those verses deals with that fact and that point. In chapter number 2, everything in the chapter about the prophecy and the visit of the Magi, and Joseph going to Egypt, and Joseph going to Nazareth, and the killing of the babies by Herod, everything that Matthew mentions, the purpose of that is to reveal that Jesus is the King of Israel. Now, again, why is this a big deal? Because Messiah in the Old Testament was the anointed one that God was going to use to bring about deliverance for Israel. The king was the one that was going to sit on David's throne as the ruler over Israel. Then we come to chapter number 3. Now, I know we've not gone over chapter 3, but I want to mention it because it's about it's all about the purpose of Matthew writing. In chapter 3, number 3, we have the voice of the messenger. Reveals that he is simply God. So in chapter 3, we have the account of John the Baptist. Why is Matthew telling us about John the Baptist? Because we find out that John the Baptist is the prophet that was promised and prophesied about that would come before God shows up and says, make his way straight and clean and plain. And so what does Matthew do? Matthew shows the Jewish readers 2,000 years ago who's learning about this man named Jesus and learning, is Jesus really the Messiah or not, and trying to learn all of these things. Matthew says, listen, he's the Messiah. Look at the vision of Mary. He's the king. Look at the visit of the Magi. And he is God. Listen to the voice of the messenger. And so this is the purpose of Matthew. So everything in these chapters focus on that. Now, why is that a big deal? So the next time that you read Matthew's gospel, and you're reading through the gospel of Matthew, and you come to Matthew chapter 1, and you're reading about all of these names in the first 16 verses, and you're like, my goodness, why do I need to know all of these names? Well, all of those names are connecting the point that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, why is Matthew telling us about the Magi? Well, I mean, there are other things that could have happened. Why is he telling me about this? It's to show that he's the king. Because the Magi they say, where's the king? We've seen his star. Then we come to chapter 3. Well, what's the big deal about John the Baptist? And because through John the Baptist, he is showing us that Jesus is God. Now, I'm saying all of that to say this. When someone asks you, well, how do you know what's going on in Matthew? You can tell them. You can explain to them. And you know for yourself, this is what is happening in the Gospel of Matthew. All right, number 2. Miranda, number 2. She does not have any of these papers. And so I piecemealed a lot of my... Hit the number, just go ahead and do the next slide. Yes. Yeah, go ahead, baby girl. Notice Matthew's prophecy. Now, we're in chapter number 2. Chapter number 2. And I want to show you that we're going to look at the 4 prophecies. I'm sorry. Hold on, Miranda. No, you're right. Yes, no, you're right. Number 2, I'm sorry. See, it's right up there, and I piecemealed this. Matthew's procedure. Man, aren't you glad we're just so professional around here? Man, just so professional. I got my papers out of order, so let me get that right there. Yes. Okay. So Matthew's procedure. Now, so what is Matthew doing? Now look at Matthew chapter number 2. Look at verse number. Let me skip down. Verse number 13. Look at verse number 13. And when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, here it is, that it might be fulfilled. Now, this is one of the prophecies, but I want you to notice that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Okay, take your Bibles. Now, we do have 4 verses, Miranda. Turn to Matthew chapter 5. Keeping in mind the word fulfilled. The word fulfilled. That is very important. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning that is because the word fulfilled means to bring to completion. It means to make full. Okay, so look in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17. We're going to look at a couple of other verses outside of the gospel here. He says, Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill, to make complete. So bear with me. We're going to go somewhere with this. He's making it complete. Okay? All right, turn to Luke 24. Luke 24. I know this is another gospel. This is Luke. Luke giving his story. Luke telling what he saw, what he knows that happened. Okay. Well, and the reason why I'm looking at this is because why Matthew is using prophecy to point to these things. Now, we talked about this in the weeks before, right? About God. We know that He's the true God. We see His faithfulness, His trustworthiness. We see Him working so that we'll know that He is God. I mean, we looked at all of that. But I want to look at Matthew's procedure in choosing these prophecies. Now, Luke 24 and verse 27, Jesus is talking to some disciples after He rose from the dead. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, He expounded unto them in all the Scriptures the things concerning Himself. So He sat down after He rose from the dead, and He took Moses, He took the prophets, He took everything in the Old Testament Scriptures, and He expounded. He opened them up and said, hey, these are things about me. All right? Okay, look down, same chapter, verse 44. Verse 44. And He said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be, here it is, same word, fulfilled, complete, filled up, brought to a completion, which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning me. Now, so what do we have? Matthew says this was fulfilled. The word of the prophet was completed at this moment in time by Christ. Now, what does that mean? Now, remember, I told you last week, there's 2 elements to prophecies. There's forthtelling, and then there's foretelling. Forthtelling is when I say, Brother Chris, you better, and then that's forthtelling. Foretelling is, this is going to happen to you, Brother Chris, a year from now. Do you see the difference? One is for now, one is for later. And so when Matthew says these words fulfilled prophecy, it is letting us know, and it is implying that there's several things about these prophecies. They were mentioned then, that He was foretelling to the people at the time, but He was foretelling of a coming event. And when the coming event came to pass, all of that prophecy was now complete. And so when we read some of the prophecies, and we're going to look at a couple, we scratch our head and say, what? I'm not quite sure. Well, right here, Christ is letting us know all of these things in the Old Testament are about me. Now, you say, well, explain a little bit more. Okay, one more passage. Turn to Colossians. Colossians chapter 2. Now, I know this is Paul. Paul is writing in Colossians 2. All right, verse 17. He's talking about the law. Okay, he is talking about the law, is what he's talking about. And how the law pointed to Christ. This is everything this is what he's talking. This is the context of Colossians 2. But I want you to look at verse 17. Colossians, you have Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. If you don't remember that order, I learned this when I was 16 years old, so you know how long ago that was. You have Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. You have Georgia Electric Power Company. There you go, you got it. Colossians chapter number 2, verse number 17. I said, I'm 42 years old and I still use that. Ephesians, Georgia Electric. Okay, yeah, okay, I know where that is now. Say, what? Look at verse 17. Which are a shadow, the law is a shadow of things to come. But the body is of Christ. Now, what is a shadow? A shadow is a reflection. What casts the shadow? The body. Now, the point that Paul is making is that the picture is that there is a sun that is shining on Jesus Christ. He's the primary target. He's the primary person. He's the primary one that we're looking at, and he is casting a shadow. And the shadow is the law, the tabernacle, the observances. Everything in the Old Testament is a shadow of him. And so Christ is the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. He's the fulfillment. He's the body. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that and I'm walking through all of these scripture verses and showing you this, you can turn back to Matthew chapter number 2, is that Matthew, in writing the gospel, he knows this. He understands this. And so Matthew, as a Jewish man, writing to Jewish readers who's trying to discover about Jesus Christ, says, He's the Messiah. He's the King. He is God. Here's prophecy of the Old Testament where he fulfills it all. He is completing what the prophets were giving to us. And so this is what Matthew is doing. It's wonderful that he is doing that. Number 3. Miranda, this should be Matthew's prophecy, I believe. Number 3. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Good job. We got them in order now. So, very quickly, we got to hurry. We got ham in there. Matthew's prophecy. We won't be done at 12 today. That's next Sunday. You want to be out of here at 12 o'clock and see the unbelievable that happened? Come next Sunday, we'll be out of here at 12. Okay, so Matthew chapter number 2. Now let's look at the 4 prophecies. Now, remember, the 4 prophecies, what is the context of Matthew 2? He is king. So all of these prophecies about Jesus are showing a relationship, or they showing that Jesus is the King of Israel. Now, we've been looking at Matthew 2, verse 5 and 6. I'm not going to take the time to look at that because we have already looked at that several weeks now. But look at chapter 2, verse 5 and 6. Number 1, the first prophecy is the prophecy of the revelation of the King. So we know the story. The Magi show up there in Jerusalem. They go to Herod. Hey, where's the king of Israel? And what do you mean the king of Israel? Call the wise men, or call the scribes, and call the priests. Hey, boys, where is he going to be born? He's going to be born in Bethlehem. We see that in verse number 5 and 6. We'll read the passage, and the prophecy is up there on the PowerPoint. Micah 5:2. That may not be big enough. I'll make that bigger next week. Look at verse number 5. We've already read it. But he says, and they said unto him in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. This is what was written by the prophet. This is not word for word. If you go back and read Micah 5:2, this is not exactly word for word what we have in our Bible. And that's okay. They're giving us the prophecy and where it was found. And where is the prophecy? And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. There's going to come a ruler in Micah 5:2 that will rule my people Israel. What did the Jews think? What did they know? This is about Messiah. This is about the king that's going to be born. Herod says, where's the king? Where's he going to be born? Where's the Messiah going to be born? And notice the connection between Messiah and king, one in the same. They say he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Well, how do you know? Because the prophecy in Micah 5 and verse number 2. And so what does Matthew do through this prophecy? He is showing us that Jesus is the fulfillment, the completer of this prophecy, and is revealing him to be the king. All right, number 2, the second prophecy. Verse number 15. Now we will turn to look at this one because I want you to understand where we've not read this prophecy very quickly. Verse 15. And was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt have I called my son. Now, so time out, pause. What's happening? The wise men go to Herod. Herod says, tell me where he is so that I can worship him. The wise men find Jesus. They worship him. That night, the wise men have a dream, and the Lord tells them, do not go to Herod. He's going to cause the child harm. The wise men wake up, and they leave, and they go another direction. Of course, we know later on in the next verse, Herod gets mad, and he's going to kill all the little babies there in Bethlehem. Now, Paul's timing out. And so what does God do to Joseph? He goes to Joseph in a dream, and he says, Joseph, in verse 13 and 14, I want you to go into Egypt. And I want you to stay in Egypt until Herod is dead. And then I'll send word for you again. Why did this happen? Matthew says in verse 15 that it might be fulfilled that was spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. And so God foresaw and foreknew that Herod was going to desire to kill the children. And we're going to turn there. It's in Hosea 11 in verse 1. God foresaw this, and God made the prophecy, I'm going to call my son out of Egypt. Now, I want you to turn back to Hosea, because this is very intriguing. Because Hosea chapter 11 and verse number 1 says nothing about Jesus, but it's talking about Israel. And so number 2 on the prophecy, man, that is really small. I will make that bigger next week, is the relationship of the king. Now, this is important, because look at Hosea 11, verse number 1. Here's the prophecy. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. Now, when we read this prophecy, you read it and there's nothing about Christ here. There's nothing about, he's Israel, and he's calling Israel out of Egypt when God first called Israel and bringing them out. And yet now Matthew is making a connection, or Matthew's saying this is a fulfillment of this. And yes, it is, but why though? Why is he making the connection? Why is Matthew saying this is a prophecy of this? Because what Matthew is doing is he is revealing the relationship that the king has with Israel. And what is that? That he is their king. And the same thing that happened to Israel is also happening to their king. Israel was chosen by God. Jesus was chosen by God. Israel was called out of Egypt, just as their king is going to be called out of Egypt. And so what Matthew is doing, again, this is all about that fulfillment, making a completion of the prophecy. Hosea is foretelling to Israel, Israel, God called you out of Egypt, but he is also foretelling of an event that one day God's son will be called out of Egypt, the king of Israel. And so what we have here, and I know this will take 30 minutes as far as diving deep into these verses, really and truly, and I know that. And when we preached this before, we did that. But here, what is happening in Matthew 2 and verse 15? He's calling His Son out of Egypt, making reference back to Israel. He's showing us the relationship. Israel belongs to God. Israel's are the people of God. Now we see this Messiah, this King, is God's King. And this is the relationship that we see. All right, the third prophecy is the restoration by the King. Now look at Matthew chapter number 2. Again, these are all the prophecies that Matthew is drawing from, Matthew is pulling from to show us that Jesus is the King and the wonderful work that God is doing through Jesus as King. So what happens in verse 16? Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceeding wroth, sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and all the coast thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. So he does this, probably in Bethlehem, in that area. It was probably anywhere between 10 and probably 20 children, which is a lot, but it's not, this was not something that was recorded in Roman history, because I hate to say it, it wasn't a big deal. It really wasn't. They would slaughter, okay, I don't like you, I'm going to kill you, you know. And so anywhere between 10 to 20 children probably were slaughtered and killed. But notice in verse 17, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy. That's Jeremiah the prophet saying. So Jeremiah made a prophecy. Here's the prophecy. In Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation and weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they are not. Now, I want you to take your Bibles and turn to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 31. This is where the prophecy is made. Now, what Matthew is revealing is the restoration by the King. Now, what he is doing, again, this is a connection. He is showing how it is a fulfillment, a completion of the prophecy. A completion of what was prophesied in the Old Testament is coming to fruition and completion through Christ here in Matthew. Matthew 31. Now, the entire context begins in verse number 10. And it goes all the way down through verse number 17. But I want you to read the prophecy, the words of Jeremiah in verse 15. This is what Matthew is copying from. Okay? Verse 15. Thus saith the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentations and bitter weeping. Rahel or Rachel weeping for her children, refused to be comforted for her children because they were not. Now, this was a forthtelling and also a foretelling. It has its completion, it has its fulfillment, it has its complete work done in Matthew chapter number 2. Now you say, well, Brother Dan, what do you mean the restoration by the King? When you read all of the verses beginning in verse 10 all the way down to verse number 17, the entire focal point is about the King that is going to come to Israel one day and one day restore all things to Israel. But before the restoration is complete, there's going to come a day of suffering. There's going to come a day of weeping. There's going to come a day of great heartache in the lives of the mothers of Israel at a particular time. So what is the connection that Matthew is making? Matthew says, remember the prophecy. Remember what Jeremiah said. There's going to be great weeping. There's going to be great pain and great sorrow. But that's going to happen before the King comes and restores. But you know the King is there when this happens to restore Israel back to where they ought to be. And so Matthew is letting Israel know, your King is here. And how do we know? Because there was a great weeping, and there was a great mourning, and there was a great day of sorrow and lamentation in the land of Bethlehem when Herod did this. Israel, know that your King is here to restore all things back to you. And so what Matthew is doing, he is showing us the revelation of the King. He'll be born in Bethlehem. Look at the wonderful relationship, Israel, that your King has with you. Just like God called you out of Egypt and set you up for Himself, He called His Son out of Egypt, His King, just like happened to you. And we see this completion, a fulfillment, a filling up of the prophecy through Christ. But then He comes to Israel again. Israel, your King is here to restore. This is a fulfillment. The great weeping Herod killing all of these children. This is a completion and a fulfillment of what Jeremiah said. Why? Because the King is here. Not why, but the connection is your King is here. And so here's the fulfillment. It's here, right here in front of you. Now what is Matthew trying to do? He is stressing to his Jewish readers 2,000 years ago who's learning about Jesus for the first time or having questions about this man named Jesus, that all of these Christians are running around saying He's the King of Israel. Well, how do we know? And Matthew says, I'm going to write a gospel. I'm going to tell you my story. I'm going to tell you what I saw. I'm going to tell you what I know. I'm going to tell you what I experienced. And here it is right here. And he brings all of these verses, and he's pointing Israel and the Jews to all of these things. And then the last prophecy that Matthew gives, you can turn back to Matthew chapter number 2. Matthew 2, very quickly. Matthew 2 in verse 20, in verse 23. But let's read verse number 19. Okay, we'll read 19 all the way down just so that you can see all of it, okay? In verse number 19. But when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother and go into the land of Israel, for they are dead which sought the young child's life. And he arose and took the young child and his mother and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father Herod, he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned aside into the parts of Galilee. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophets, He shall be called a Nazarene. Now this is one of the more difficult prophecies that Matthew is calling upon. And the reason is because in the Old Testament, there is no prophecy that says this. There's no prophecy in the Old Testament that says, He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, there are those that think the word Nazarene here is a connection to a Hebrew word in Hebrews 11 and verse 1. Isaiah 11 and verse 1, and the word is branch. A branch shall come forth out of David, and the word branch there in the Hebrew is netzer. And so some try to make a connection between the word netzer and the word Nazarene. Others have taken this word to say, well, this is a prophecy of Jesus of Nazareth, of a Nazarene, that Jesus is going to take a Nazarite vow. And they'll try to make that connection, but there's nothing in the Scriptures either way. You say, well, brother, what is the point? Now, notice what Matthew says in Matthew 2. That it might be fulfilled that something, he went to Nazareth, that something can be completed, something can find its full fulfillment, which was spoken by, now notice this, by the prophets, plural. In Matthew 2, when Herod wanted to know, they said it was written in the prophet. Here they leave and they go to, or Herod kills them. Matthew says, Jeremy the prophet. Okay, and then spoken by the Lord, by the prophet, out of Egypt have I called my son. He is very careful to mention prophet, singular. One prophet said this, one prophet said this, one prophet said that. But here, Matthew 2:23, he uses the plural prophets. More than one prophet prophesied of this. Now, you say, Brother Dan, what is the prophecy about? The prophecy is about for the rejection of the king. Now, I have Isaiah 53, 1 through 3, because it's a prophecy that Messiah, the king, would be rejected by his people. Now, you say, well, Brother Dan, why are you saying that this is a prophecy concerning the rejection of the king? Later on in Matthew's gospel, we find out, and later on in John's gospel, when people find out that Jesus is from Nazareth, what do they always say? You're crazy. There's no prophet coming out of Nazareth. There's no good things going to come out of Nazareth. Man, those people are poor. Those people have nothing. Those people are the scum of the earth, man. What are you talking about? Nazareth, a Nazarene, man, those people, they have nothing. And the city of Nazareth and the town of Nazareth was rejected and looked down upon with scorn by the Jewish people living around him. And so what Matthew is doing here, Matthew tells us, listen, he moved to Nazareth. He went to Nazareth that the Old Testament prophets, it could be fulfilled that your king lived in Nazareth and he was rejected by you just like the people of Nazareth are rejected. Just like all of those people there, they're rejected and they're looked down upon as the scum of the earth. So your king fulfilled the prophecies of all the prophets that your king would be rejected by you when he arrives. And all through the Gospel of Matthew, we see this point, this reiterated over and over and over again. The people rejected their Messiah. They rejected their king. They went so far as to crucify him in Matthew 27. And so here in Matthew, Matthew is giving us 4 prophecies. And in these prophecies, the revelation of the king, the relationship of the king, the restoration by the king, and the rejection of the king. All 4 of these, some are specifically mentioned as a prophecy. This prophecy specifically mentioned. Others, there's, Miranda, I think number 4, go ahead and turn number 4 up. I believe it's the picture of Matthew's picture. This is the picture that Matthew is giving us, okay? In Matthew chapter number 2, using these 4 prophecies, there's 3 things very quickly. He is showing us the connection of Christ with Israel. This is what he's not trying to do. How do you say that about Matthew's gospel, right? This is what Matthew is doing. He is showing us the connection of Christ with Israel. Even though Hosea 11:1 is about Israel, Matthew is showing the connection between their king with Israel. Even though there's not a specific prophet or prophets that said he's going to be out of Nazareth, he's going to be called a Nazarene, but because of the people understanding what Nazareth was, it was the city of rejection, it was the place of rejection. Matthew says the prophets prophesied your king would be rejected. He's showing them the connection. Number 2, Matthew's picture is the choosing of Christ and Israel. In all 4 of these prophecies, Israel is the one that is in focus. Israel themselves are in the focal point, how God chose Israel. And so what Matthew does in these four prophecies, he is showing us that Jesus the King was chosen, just as Israel was chosen. Israel was chosen as the place where he would be born. And so there's that connection in showing us the choosing. Jeremiah prophesied of great sorrow and great pain. And yet there's going to come a restoration by the king. God chose Israel for this and the king. And then thirdly, there is the calling of Christ in Israel. And he called his son out of Egypt, Israel. Now he's calling the Son of God out of Egypt. And Matthew again is showing the Israelites and he is showing the Jewish people the connection of these Old Testament prophets and the Old Testament prophecies and how that Christ is the ultimate fulfillment, the completion of this. And remember what Paul said, Christ is the body, all of these things are the shadow. So all of these prophecies are a shadow of the true fulfillment of Christ who stands then before them. So here in Matthew 2 we have Christmas prophecies. And why are they so important? Because he is showing us the connection, the choosing, and the calling of Christ and of Israel. He is showing us the revelation, the relationship, the restoration, and ultimately the rejection of Israel's king by Israel. And Matthew is showing us all of these wonderful things in Matthew chapter number 2. So as you read the Gospel of Matthew, or any other gospel, and you're reading this, and you come across these words, this was fulfilled. This was fully completed at this time by Christ and by those alive at that particular time. So now at Christmas season, Christmas time, and Cheryl, you can, in just a few minutes, we'll be ready to have an invitation. Here at Christmas time, I know we always remember, Jesus is the reason for this season, and we know that. And, He is. So as we come to this time, this next week and next couple of weeks, as we get to Christmas and then go to the new year, consider Jesus Christ. Consider all that God has done for us and the salvation that He offers to any and to all that comes through Christ. And if you're here and you've never been born again, you've never been saved, this will be a great time. Say, God, I am a sinner and I need Jesus to save me. And if you are a Christian and you are saved, my desire for you truly is this, to make your calling and your election, to make it sure, to firm it up, for you to know why this is in the Bible. Why is it important for me to know this? It's not just some story. Oh, here comes the three wise men. No! It's deeper than that. It's deeper than the manger, the nativity. It's deeper than all of that. Thousands of years God prophesied, hundreds of years, and Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of all of these things. Let me ask you to bow your heads and to close your eyes. And Cheryl will have a time of invitation.